So today, as we step into part 2 of our series, we return to the question that's kind of driving our series. And that question is, how do we actually follow this kind of king? How do we actually follow King Jesus? So to help us continue to answer this question today, we're going to look at one of the earliest and first invitations Jesus made to a group of disciples. Now, this invitation that he makes to these first followers of Jesus, to these first disciples, is not that unusual, actually. Like it's helpful to have a context and history and understand what's going on. Because at that time and in that culture, in the way that the Jewish people were raised, it was really important to teach your kids everything to know about God. To understand the story of God, the arc of God. Like Exodus was a huge, pivotal, a hinge part of their story that is like everything. You need to understand that we were in slavery and then we were rescued. And you would memorize all the laws and you would learn all of this growing up. So then when rabbis would come around and call young people to follow them, they would have expectation that these students would have a whole bunch of knowledge already. That they would already know a whole bunch of things. And so rabbis would then invite these students, often the very promising students, to follow them, learn from them, and eventually carry on their teaching. Even though it happened all the time, most students didn't make the cut. Like they would follow, they would learn, they would go through the whole process, they would walk in the footsteps of the rabbi, and eventually the rabbi's like, you got some good information, you're getting things, but you're just not going to make it. So, thank you for this time, but go back to your family and practice your family trade. So if your parents are carpenters, go back to carpentry. That's where you belong. You didn't quite make this theological cut, so go back to do that thing. Go back to your ordinary life and perfect and become an expert in that field. We need you. We need good carpenters. We need good fishermen. We need good, and you can fill in the blank. So what makes this story so interesting is Jesus doesn't actually go and call out some of these elite students. He doesn't go to the top of the class and say, hey, you're the one, come on. Rather, he meets these future disciples right in their everyday work, in their family trade, right in the middle of their normal lives. Now, that's important because that likely means that these guys did not make the cut. So our story is located in this area. It's like at the north end of the Sea of Galilee there, like kind of northwest area. And so Jesus meets his disciples there. Now, this location matters because this is a place where there's lots of fishermen. There's a lot of people that are practicing their family trade. This is what they do. They live near this lake, the sea. They live there. They catch fish. They know how to do it. They are fishermen. But Simon lets him use his boat. And it's actually a really practical moment. It gives him room to teach, right? He's being pressed in. There's so many people there. So he gets to get in the water, he gets a bit more space, and it's kind of like a neat geographical know-how there because there's these natural inlets at the Sea of Galilee, and so when you're in the water, it carries the sound almost like an outdoor amphitheater. So this is great, people can hear better. But there's actually even more going on here. Simon is not just asked to leave and follow. Luke reminds us that he's listening on the shore. There he is, cleaning the nets after the night's hard work all through the night. He's at work, at his trade, at his family business, in the world he knows. And Jesus steps into his space. And not only does Jesus ask him to use his boat, Jesus leans in as he's teaching and as Peter's listening and says, can I use your boat? Can I use the work? Can I use your work? Can I use your tools to do my work? There's a lot going on here. There's something in what Jesus is asking Peter to do that should make us stop and really freeze in this moment. Because Jesus now no longer is asking, can I use your boat? Can I do my work at your work? He's not just requesting it. He's actually now beginning to speak into Peter's world. Peter knows his craft. He knows the lake. He knows the rhythms of the sea. He knows the rhythms of the fish. He knows when to fish and when not to fish. He already let this guy use his boat, but now he asks to do more, which is, of course, why this request is so important. Because Jesus knows that Peter has been listening. He knows that Peter has been watching, observing. He knows that Peter is curious. And actually, we know that Jesus is not starting at ground zero with Peter. Because in the previous chapter of Luke, we read that Jesus was at his house. And he also healed his mother-in-law from a fever, which is an interesting detail. But he also healed other people near Peter. Fishing is something Peter knows better than most, and that's exactly where Jesus asked him to actually trust him, to do something that goes against everything Peter has learned from a lifetime experience. So now, all of a sudden for Peter, this is not just some abstract God talk. It's not some theological what ifs and what's the tensions, and it's kind of like lives there out there somewhere. Now for Peter, this is very personal. Now, if we don't fly by this verse really quickly and actually stay with it, we begin to see just really how personal it is. Because the story hits closer to home for many of us. Because I would suggest, and in my time as pastoring, I have seen, and I've seen it in my own life, I'm really open about Jesus speaking into spaces of my life and places of my life where I feel weak, where I feel lost. Places where I don't know what's happening, and I'm wondering, and I'm hypothesizing, or places where there's suffering, and I'm like, God, please step into this space in my life. Help me here. I don't understand. Why is this happening? But what about places that we know well? What about our expertise, our routines, our relationships, our parenting, our work, our money, our habits, our instincts? What happens when Jesus asks us to trust him in those spaces? What happens when he asks us to do something differently in the very part of life where we think, I know how this works. I have done this a million times. I know what success looks like here. So Jesus, help me out in these other areas, but like this, I got this, Jesus. Jesus, what you're asking for in this part of my life will not get the results. I've done this a million times. And yet here comes Jesus and says, I want to do something you have done a million times, but I want you to do it differently. So in that moment, against his better judgment, Peter embodies what faith looks like. Which is not pretending you have all the answers to all your questions, or you don't have questions all of a sudden now. It's just you take a step of trust. See, faith is not pretending obedience always feels efficient or logical. Faith is not having the whole future mapped out. Faith is saying, Jesus, this does not fully make sense to me right now, but because you say so, I will. But can I suggest that there's actually another layer going on here that's simply much more than just, well, I just got to listen to Jesus. I mean, that's an important step too, but I think there's more going on here. Because the story is really no longer about fish, is it? Because the miracle is not just the answer to a need, it's a revelation into Peter's life. Peter now fully sees that he's standing in the presence of someone far more than a teacher. All the things he couldn't sort, all the information, all the things he was seeing before, he couldn't quite figure out. But now he sees that this person is far greater than just a rabbi. And as that clarity about Jesus is revealed to Peter, what happens to him at the same time is that Peter realizes who Jesus is, but in that same moment, Peter recognizes who he is. And often that's actually the pattern in the story of God. When people encounter the living God, they become aware of the gap between who God is and who they are. So Peter's response is so immediate. Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. This isn't just like exaggerated random comment. It's a natural reaction to holiness. Jesus encounters Peter right in the middle of his actual life, at work, in the boat, with the nets, in the place where his skill and strength and instincts have been formed over years. He then tells Peter, I will use your gifts for the kingdom. I will make you a fisherman for people. When Jesus calls people to follow, what we learn here is your job, your gifts, your training, your abilities, they don't get erased. They get renewed. None of Peter's gifts and learned skills are wasted. They are simply being drawn into something larger, something Peter couldn't have imagined on his own. Because following Jesus isn't just about learning ideas or agreeing with truths about him. It begins there, sure, it begins there. But it can't stay there. The invitation to follow is an invitation into action, into a life that actually starts to shift directions in your life. That your life actually becomes different. Which means all those parts of your life, your work, your instincts, your story, they don't actually get erased. They just get reoriented. redirected, renewed, pulled into the flow of what God is doing in this world. And when you begin to see that, when you catch even a glimpse of it, it makes sense why this fishermen leave everything behind. Because they have just been invited into something more with all of who they are. Friends, and that's the story of God. The promise of Jesus is that now beyond the cross, after the resurrection, he's actually not distant. He meets you right in your ordinary life, in your work, in all your routines, in all those things, in all your places that you know best, where you're an expert. He actually meets you there. He's there, right by your boat, asking if he can step in.